Hi there. Let your mind slow down and relax your body. We aim to be calm and peaceful. And please, in the comments, write down your best help for sleeping and let me know where you are from. And never forget that you are loved and important in this world to somebody. You are unique and we love you. The room beneath the stairs. The house my parents bought when I was 10 was massive. An old Victorian with countless rooms and a basement I swore was haunted. My mom dismissed my fears as an overactive imagination, but the house always felt wrong. Shadows lingered in the corners longer than they should, and the floorboards creaked in ways that didn't match anyone's movements. It wasn't until I was 13 that I discovered the small door beneath the staircase. We had been living there for years, but I'd never noticed it before. The door was tiny, barely big enough for a child to fit through, and it was painted the same color as the wall, blending in almost perfectly. I found it by accident, my foot brushing against a loose floorboard that revealed the edge of the frame. "Mom, did you know there's a door under the stairs?" I asked later that day. She frowned. "No, honey. It's probably just an old crawl space. Don't mess with it." Of course, that only made me more curious. The next day, while my parents were out, I grabbed a flashlight and pried the door open. The hinges groaned as it swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway that sloped downward into darkness. The air that wafted out was cold and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I hesitated, but my curiosity won out. I crawled through the door, the flashlight's beam illuminating rough stone walls and a dirt floor. The passage twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the end. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a room. The space was small, the walls lined with shelves that held dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on it sat a tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked, its empty eyes staring straight ahead. As I stepped closer, the air grew heavier, pressing against my chest. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, low and insistent, coming from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as the whispering grew louder, filling my ears. I scrambled back up the passageway, the whispers following me, rising to a deafening roar. When I burst into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house. I never opened the door again. My parents sold the house a few years later, and I didn't argue when they said we were moving. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear those whispers, angry, accusing, waiting. The passenger. I was driving home late one night, the highway empty except for the occasional semi-truck roaring past. The stretch of road I was on was notorious for being desolate, with no gas stations or rest stops for miles. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless pavement ahead and the dense woods that lined the road. It was past midnight, and fatigue was starting to set in. I turned up the radio to keep myself awake, humming along to the static-filled music. That's when I saw him. A man was standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in a classic hitchhiker's gesture. He was tall and lanky, wearing a tattered coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but something about him made me uneasy. I kept driving, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I passed him. My rearview mirror showed his figure shrinking into the distance, motionless except for his outstretched hand. I shook off the feeling of unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing on the side of the road in the exact same position. Thumb out, hood pulled low. My stomach twisted. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't taken any turns and my car hadn't slowed down. I pressed down on the gas, speeding past him without a second glance. My pulse quickened as I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him again. But the road was empty. I tried to focus on the drive, ignoring the sinking feeling in my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head, and my blood ran cold. He was standing on the shoulder, just a few feet from my car, keeping pace with me. His head turned slowly toward me, and though his face was still hidden, I could feel his gaze boring into me. I screamed, slamming my foot on the gas. My car roared forward, and when I looked back, he was gone. The rest of the drive was a blur of panic and adrenaline. When I finally reached my driveway, I jumped out of the car and ran inside, locking every door and window. I stayed up all night, staring at the curtains and waiting for something, anything, to happen. The next morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the road to my front porch. The prints stopped just outside my door. The tunnel. Growing up, there was a storm drain on the edge of town that everyone called the tunnel. It was an old concrete pipe that stretched for miles underground, its entrance overgrown with weeds and graffiti. Kids in my neighborhood dared each other to explore it, but most of us never made it more than a few feet inside. The darkness was suffocating, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. When I was 14, my friends and I decided to explore it for real. Armed with flashlights and a map someone had printed off the internet, we crawled into the tunnel one hot summer afternoon. The air inside was cool and damp, and the sound of our footsteps echoed eerily off the walls. At first, it was exciting. We laughed and joked, our voices bouncing through the narrow space as we followed the winding path. The graffiti on the walls grew stranger the farther we went. Words and symbols that didn't make sense, painted in what looked like rust-colored streaks. Then we found the first shoe. It was lying in the middle of the tunnel, covered in mud and mold. It looked old, but not ancient. Something someone might have worn a few months ago. We exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on, the bravado of the dare keeping us moving forward. The second shoe was farther in, lying on its side near the wall. It was the same size and style as the first, as if they had belonged to the same person. We turned a corner, and the flashlight beams illuminated something that made us all stop. A figure was crouched at the far end of the tunnel, its back to us. Its clothes were filthy and torn, and its shoulders moved in a slow, jerky rhythm, like it was breathing or sobbing. "Hello?" one of my friends called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. Then slowly, it began to turn. We didn't wait to see its face. We ran, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we scrambled back toward the entrance. The air grew colder as we ran, and I swear I could hear faint whispers following us, growing louder with each step. When we finally burst out into the sunlight, gasping for air, we realized we weren't alone. Two muddy shoes sat just outside the entrance, neatly placed side by side. The Last Room. When my grandfather passed away, my family inherited his house. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion on the edge of town, filled with antique furniture and creaky floorboards. I loved exploring it as a kid, imagining the kind of life he must have lived in such a grand old house. But there was one room we never opened. The door was at the end of the second-floor hallway, its surface scratched and worn. My grandfather had always kept it locked, and he never talked about what was inside. After his death, my parents told me not to go near it. "It's just storage," they said. "Nothing you need to worry about." One rainy afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. While my parents were sorting through his belongings downstairs, I found the key to the locked room tucked away in a drawer. It was old and heavy, its metal tarnished with age. The door creaked as I turned the key, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. The room beyond was dark, the air stale and heavy. I flicked on my flashlight, illuminating a small empty space. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. At first I thought the room was completely empty, but then I saw it. A mirror propped against the far wall. Its surface was cloudy and cracked, the silver backing peeling away in places. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and warped in the cracked glass. As I reached out to touch it, my flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something else. It wasn't my reflection. The figure in the mirror was taller, its face obscured by shadows. Its head tilted slowly, and its hand reached up, pressing against the glass from the other side. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as the air grew colder. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I pounded on the door, screaming for my parents, but the handle wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. A faint tapping on the mirror, slow and deliberate. When the door finally opened, I bolted into the hallway, my heart racing. My parents found me trembling on the stairs, unable to explain what had happened. We sold the house a few months later, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I feel like I'm not alone. Like there's something, or someone, watching me from the other side. The Bells in the Fog. The coastal town where I grew up was a place of endless fog, where the sea and sky often blurred into one gray, indistinct mass. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs was constant, a backdrop to every conversation, every thought. The fog rolled in and out unpredictably, swallowing entire streets and leaving behind a damp chill that seeped into your bones. Everyone in town had heard the bells at some point. They were faint, carried on the breeze, but always unmistakable, deep, resonant, and slow. They seemed to come from nowhere. The church bells never rang in foggy weather, and no ships ever docked near our treacherous cliffs. Yet the bells were real. My mother was particularly superstitious about them. "When the bells ring, you stay inside," she'd say, her face pale. "You stay away from the cliffs." I never fully understood her fear until the summer I turned 14. It was a particularly foggy evening, the kind where the mist curled into the streets like ghostly fingers. My mother and I were sitting on the porch, watching the world disappear around us, when I heard it, the low, mournful toll of a bell. It sounded impossibly distant, like it was coming from beneath the ocean. "Inside," my mother said sharply, standing up so suddenly she nearly knocked over her chair. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. "What is it?" I asked, confused. "Nothing for you to worry about," she muttered, checking the locks on the windows. "Just stay inside tonight." Her reaction only made me more curious. I couldn't understand why a sound as simple as bells could unnerve her so much. The next day, I asked some of the older kids at school if they'd ever heard the bells. "Everyone has," said my friend Jamie, his voice hushed. "My granddad says they're a warning, like when the bells ring, something bad's about to happen." "What kind of bad?" I asked. Jamie shrugged. "I don't know. People disappear sometimes, mostly fishermen. My uncle said he saw someone walking into the fog once, heading toward the cliffs. They never came back." That night the bells rang again. I couldn't sleep. The sound echoed faintly through the house, growing louder and softer as if it were drifting on the fog itself. I got out of bed and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The street was empty, the mist so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. Then I saw it. A figure moved in the fog, barely visible. It was tall and thin, its outline shifting as though it were part of the mist. It walked slowly, deliberately, heading toward the cliffs. "Hello?" I whispered, though I knew they couldn't hear me. The figure stopped. For a moment, it didn't move, as though it were listening. Then it turned its head, and though I couldn't see a face, I felt it looking at me. My chest tightened, and I let the curtain fall back into place, stumbling away from the window. I wanted to tell my mother, but I was too scared. What if she wouldn't believe me? Worse, what if she would? I stayed in bed, pulling the covers over my head, listening as the bells grew softer until they disappeared entirely. The next morning, the fog was gone, and the sun was shining. But when I walked to school, I heard people whispering about the old lighthouse keeper, Mr. Renner. His door had been found wide open, his house empty. No one had seen him since the night before. That was the first time I truly felt the weight of the bells. In the years that followed, I heard them many times, but I never went to the cliffs again when they rang. The figure in the fog haunted my dreams, and every time someone disappeared, I wondered if they had seen it too. Now, when I visit my hometown, I still hear the bells on foggy nights, and though I try to convince myself it's just the wind, deep down, I know better. They're calling someone. They always are. The room that never ends. When I moved into my new apartment, I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. It was cheap, spacious, and located in the heart of the city. The building was old, sure, but it had charm. High ceilings, large windows, and hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. For the first month, everything was perfect. I spent my weekends decorating, making the space my own. The neighbors were friendly, the utilities reliable. Even the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Callahan, seemed genuinely kind, though he was oddly vague about the building's history. "You've got a good unit," he said when I signed the lease. "But just don't go poking around too much, okay?" I thought he was joking at the time. The trouble started late one night when I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning in bed, my mind restless, when I noticed something strange, a faint draft coming from the hallway. It was odd because I'd checked the windows earlier, and they were all shut. I got up to investigate, and that's when I saw it. The door. It was at the end of the hallway where there hadn't been a door before. The wood was old, the paint chipped and peeling. A tarnished brass handle gleamed faintly in the dim light. At first I thought I must be imagining things, I'd walked down that hallway dozens of times, and there had never been a door there. But when I reached out, the handle was solid, cold to the touch. I tried the knob, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door opened into a narrow staircase that spiraled downward. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew. My heart pounded as I flicked on the hallway light, illuminating the steps below. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and started down the stairs. The wood groaned under my weight, each step echoing in the enclosed space. At the bottom of the staircase, I found another door. This one was heavier, with deep scratches carved into its surface. I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I gripped the handle. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room beyond was impossible. It was my apartment. Everything was identical. The furniture, the photos on the walls, even the faint coffee stain on the living room rug. But it wasn't right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and the light from my phone seemed dimmer, swallowed by the space around me. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the door was gone. The walls were seamless, as though no door had ever existed. Panic set in as I searched for a way out, but the apartment was a perfect, suffocating replica of my own. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. I backed into the corner, clutching my phone like a weapon as the footsteps grew louder. The door to the hallway creaked open, and I saw it. A shadow, tall and angular, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stepped into the room, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet on invisible strings. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was back in my real apartment, gasping for air. The mysterious door was gone, and the hallway was as it had always been. I moved out the next day. But sometimes, late at night, I feel a faint draft in the hallway, and I wonder if the door will appear again. And if it does, I know better than to open it. The silent choir. The church at the edge of town had always felt out of place. Its Gothic spires pierced the sky like accusing fingers, and its weathered stone facade seemed perpetually damp, even on the sunniest days. No one I knew ever attended services there, yet its bells tolled every Sunday morning without fail, their deep, resonant tones carrying across the quiet streets. I had passed it countless times on my way to school, but I never thought much about it until one rainy afternoon. I had stayed late for a club meeting, and by the time I was walking home, the streets were deserted. The church loomed ahead, its windows dark and unwelcoming. That's when I heard it. Singing. It was faint, almost inaudible over the sound of the rain, but unmistakable. A choir, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. The melody was strange, dissonant, unlike any hymn I'd ever heard. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the church. The doors were closed, and no lights shone from within. The logical part of me wanted to keep walking, to leave the strange sound behind. But something about the music pulled me closer. It wasn't beautiful, far from it. It was unsettling, like the voices were out of sync, straining against each other. And yet, I couldn't resist. The heavy wooden doors creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. The interior of the church was dim, lit only by the faint glow of candles at the altar. The singing was louder now, reverberating off the stone walls. But the church was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The singing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I stepped farther inside, the air growing colder with each step. My eyes darted to the shadows, searching for any sign of movement, but the church was still. Then I saw them. They were seated in the pews, their forms barely visible in the flickering candlelight. There must have been 20 or 30 of them, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in prayer. Their clothes were old, tattered, and covered in grime, as though they had been buried and forgotten. Who are you?" I whispered. One by one they lifted their heads. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow and dark, their mouths slightly open as though frozen mid-song. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, as if I weren't really there. The singing began again, soft and haunting. Their mouths moved in unison, but the sound came from everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling the church. The melody was wrong, twisting and turning in ways that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the figures began to rise from the pews. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were being pulled upward by invisible strings. The singing grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound that made my head ache. I ran. The doors slammed shut behind me as I burst out into the rain, gasping for air. The singing faded into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling of their hollow eyes watching me. I never walked past that church again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint strains of their eerie melody drifting through the air. The shadow beneath the bed. When I was a kid, I had an irrational fear of the space beneath my bed. My parents chalked it up to an overactive imagination, dismissing my nightly insistence that there was something lurking in the shadows. "There's nothing under there," my mom would say, peeking beneath the bed to reassure me. But no matter how many times she checked, the feeling never went away. I grew out of it eventually, or at least I thought I did. Years later, when I moved into my first apartment, the fear came back. The apartment was small but cozy, with just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a dresser. My room had a large window that let in plenty of light during the day, but at night, the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. It started with the noises, faint, scratching sounds that woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was mice or the neighbors moving furniture. But the sounds weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from beneath the bed. I told myself it was just my imagination, a lingering echo of childhood fears. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. One night, armed with a flashlight, I decided to look. I knelt on the floor, my heart pounding, and shone the beam of light under the bed. There was nothing there. Relief washed over me, and I laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But as I sat back up, I noticed something strange. The flashlight was still on, and its beam illuminated the far wall. But the shadow of the bed, it wasn't right. The legs of the bed cast shadows, as they should, but there was something else. A larger shadow, shapeless and wrong, stretched across the wall. It moved slightly, shifting as though it were breathing. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow grew darker, more defined, and I realized it wasn't on the wall. It was coming out of the bed. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat as the shadow began to stretch upward, forming a vaguely human shape. Its head tilted toward me, though it had no eyes, no features, just an endless void of black. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day I packed my things and moved out. I left the bed behind. Now, years later, I still wake up some nights to the sound of scratching. And when I do, I make sure to keep my feet firmly on the bed, afraid of what might be waiting beneath. The staircase that led nowhere. My uncle's house was ancient, the kind of place that felt alive with its own creaks and groans. It was a sprawling Victorian on the outskirts of town, a house built in a time when grand architecture was a sign of wealth and status. My uncle had inherited it years ago, but rarely lived there. He claimed it was too big, too much work to maintain, but I always suspected he didn't like being alone in it. When I turned 18, he offered to let me stay there while I got on my feet. The prospect of living rent-free was too good to pass up, and I moved in almost immediately. The house was massive, with more rooms than I could count. The furniture was old and dusty, the wallpaper peeling in places, but I loved it. There was one part of the house, however, that always felt wrong: the back staircase. It was tucked away behind a heavy door in the kitchen, a narrow spiral of steps that wound upward into darkness. My uncle told me to avoid it. "Use the main staircase," he said, his face unusually serious. "That one hasn't been safe in years." I didn't question him at first. The house was old after all, and it wasn't surprising that some parts of it were unstable. But late one night, curiosity got the better of me. I was in the kitchen, the house silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The door to the back staircase loomed in the corner, almost inviting. I grabbed a flashlight and opened it. The air beyond was cool and damp, smelling faintly of mildew. The narrow wooden steps disappeared into the darkness above, their edges worn smooth from decades of use. I hesitated, then started to climb. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing eerily in the confined space. I counted each step, my flashlight illuminating the way. At 20 steps, I reached a landing, where another set of stairs wound upward. But something was off. I realized I should have reached the second floor by now. The house wasn't tall enough to require so many steps, yet the staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward. I turned, shining my flashlight back down, but the kitchen door was nowhere in sight. Just more stairs spiraling into the darkness below. Panic set in as I climbed faster, my breaths coming in short gasps. The walls felt closer now, pressing in on me, the air growing heavier with each step. At 40 steps, I saw a faint glow above me, like light filtering through a crack in a door. Relief flooded me as I reached the top. A small door stood in the wall, its edges outlined in a dim, flickering light. I reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, the light went out. The door creaked open on its own. Beyond it was a room I didn't recognize. It wasn't part of the house. It couldn't be. The walls were covered in a dark, wet substance that dripped onto the floor, pooling around the legs of a single chair in the center of the room. The chair faced away from me, its occupant slumped forward, motionless. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering weakly. As I reached the threshold, the figure turned its head slowly, its face pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and dark. A wide grin stretched across its face, its teeth impossibly sharp. I stumbled back, the door slamming shut in front of me. The light from my flashlight died completely, plunging me into total darkness. I ran. I didn't count the steps this time, didn't care where they led. The staircase twisted and turned, the air growing colder with every step. When I finally burst through a door, I found myself back in the kitchen, gasping for air. The door to the staircase slammed shut behind me, and I didn't open it again. My uncle never asked why I stopped using the kitchen late at night, and I never told him. But sometimes, when I walk past that door, I hear faint footsteps on the stairs, always going up, but never coming down. The thing in the mirror. The first time I noticed something was wrong with my mirror, I thought I was just imagining things. It was a small, rectangular mirror hung above the sink in my bathroom. Nothing fancy. The apartment came with it, and I never gave it much thought. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up and caught a flicker of movement in the mirror. It was subtle, barely noticeable, like a shadow passing behind me. But when I turned, the bathroom was empty. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. But over the next few days, it happened again and again. Every time the movement became more distinct, a fleeting image of something just out of view. One night, I decided to test it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring into my reflection, daring whatever it was to appear. Minutes passed, the room silent, except for the hum of the bathroom fan. Just as I was about to give up, I saw it. The reflection of my face smiled. It wasn't my smile. My lips didn't move, but the face in the mirror grinned at me, wide and unnatural. Its eyes darkened, the whites disappearing into black voids. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the reflection returned to normal. I covered the mirror with a towel that night, too terrified to look into it again. But the next morning, the towel was on the floor, and the mirror was uncovered. Things escalated quickly after that. I began hearing faint whispers whenever I walked past the bathroom, the sound too low to make out, but unmistakably there. At night, I'd wake to the sensation of being watched, the air in my bedroom cold and heavy. One evening, I found the mirror cracked. A single jagged line split its surface, as though something had tried to claw its way through. I should have gotten rid of it then, but I was afraid. Afraid that whatever was in the mirror might not stay trapped if I removed it. The final straw came a week later. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, clearer. The voice was coming from the bathroom. I got up, my hands trembling as I approached the door. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though the voice knew I was there. I pushed the door open, my stomach churning. The mirror was glowing faintly, its cracked surface pulsating with a dim, sickly light. My reflection stared back at me, grinning again, its head tilted to one side. Slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The glass began to ripple, like water. I ran out of the apartment that night and never went back. I left everything behind, including the mirror. But sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of something that doesn't belong, something smiling back at me. The house at the end of Hollow Road. When I was a child, there was a house at the end of Hollow Road that everyone in the neighborhood avoided. It was an old 2-story structure with peeling paint, sagging shutters, and a yard overgrown with weeds. The windows were always dark, like empty sockets in a skull. The local kids whispered stories about the house, that it was haunted, that strange noises came from inside at night, that people who went in didn't always come back out. My parents told me to stay away from it, but that only made it more intriguing. Every time I rode my bike past the house, I couldn't help but slow down, staring at its warped facade and imagining what might be hidden inside. One summer evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, my friends dared me to go in. I was 12 and desperate to prove I wasn't afraid of anything. So, armed with a flashlight and a bravado I didn't truly feel, I pushed open the rusty gate and made my way up the cracked stone path. The front door creaked loudly as I opened it, the sound echoing through the empty house. The air inside was cold and smelled of mildew, the faint scent of rot lingering beneath it. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of the floorboards beneath my feet. The living room was empty, the furniture long gone, but faint outlines on the walls marked where pictures had once hung. A staircase spiraled upward in the corner, its banister splintered and sagging. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. I moved farther inside, my flashlight flickering as I swept it across the room. In the far corner, I noticed something strange. A single chair facing the wall. It looked newer than the rest of the house, its wooden frame polished and unscathed. I stepped closer, my footsteps hesitant. The chair was empty, but as I reached out to touch it, I heard a faint sound behind me, a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. My heart pounded as I backed away from the chair, the beam of light shaking in my trembling hand. And then I saw it. At the top of the staircase, a figure stood motionless in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted slightly to one side. Though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its eyes on me, sharp and unblinking. The figure took a step forward, the floor groaning beneath its weight. My breath caught in my throat as it moved down the stairs, its movements slow and deliberate. I bolted for the door, my legs pumping as fast as they could. The air grew colder as I ran, and I swore I could hear footsteps behind me, impossibly heavy and fast. I didn't stop until I was outside, the rusty gate slamming shut behind me. When I turned back, the figure was standing in the doorway, its head tilted even farther, its shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light of the setting sun. I never went near that house again. A few years later, it was torn down, the land sold to developers. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the house and the figure at the top of the stairs. And when I wake, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me, waiting for me to come back. The light in the field. My grandparents' farm was a place of endless fields, stretching as far as the eye could see. I spent every summer there as a child, running through the tall grass and playing hide and seek among the rows of corn. It was peaceful, quiet, and far removed from the hustle of city life. But there was one part of the farm that no one ever went near, the fallow field at the edge of the property. My grandfather called it the dead field, though he never explained why. It was smaller than the other fields, its soil dry and cracked, the grass thin and brittle. Nothing ever grew there, no matter how much water or fertilizer was used. "Stay away from that field," my grandmother would warn me, her voice unusually stern. "It's not safe." One night while lying in bed, I saw it for the first time. a faint, flickering light in the dead field. It was small, like the flame of a candle, and it swayed gently as though someone were carrying it. I stared at it for what felt like hours, too scared to move, until it finally disappeared. The next morning, I asked my grandparents about it. They exchanged a look, one that made my stomach twist. "It's nothing," my grandfather said gruffly, refusing to meet my eyes. "Just a trick of the light." But I knew it wasn't. The light returned the next night. This time it was closer, hovering near the edge of the field. I couldn't take my eyes off it, mesmerized by its slow, rhythmic movement. It seemed almost alive, like it was beckoning me. I waited until my grandparents had gone to bed before slipping outside. The night was cool and quiet, the stars hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The light swayed gently in the distance, its glow casting faint shadows on the dry, cracked ground. As I approached the field, the air grew colder, the silence deeper. The light remained still, waiting for me. My heart pounded as I stepped into the field, the brittle grass crunching underfoot. When I was just a few feet away, the light flickered and dimmed. For a moment I thought it would disappear entirely, but then it flared brighter, revealing a figure standing behind it. It was tall and thin, its features hidden in the shadows. Its hand reached out toward me, impossibly long fingers beckoning. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The light dimmed again, and I felt a cold, heavy presence pressing against my chest, like the weight of 1,000 voices whispering in my ear. I don't remember how I got back to the house. The next thing I knew, I was lying in bed, my grandmother sitting beside me, her face pale and drawn. She never asked what happened, and I never told her. The dead field was fenced off after that, the gate locked tight. But sometimes, when I visit the farm, I see the faint glow of the light in the distance, swaying gently, waiting for someone to come closer.